Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is to deliver the essential strategic insights buried within complex historical documents. We're diving deep into a period of the Vietnam War that it fundamentally shifted the global understanding of military power. We're talking about those critical years from the strategic shock of the 1968 Tet Offensive all the way through the final American withdrawal in 1973.
And that half-decade, it represents one of the most drastic military transformations in history. We're really zeroing in on the shifting role and strategies of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam as it navigated this transition. I mean, you see it go from this overwhelming combat engagement to advisory roles and, eventually complete disengagement. It's a fascinating look at how military strategy succumbs to political reality.
Absolutely. And the sources we're relying on today are truly foundational for understanding this period. We're using extensive excerpts from Graham A. Cosmos's Meticulous History, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, the Joint Command in the Years of Withdrawal, 1968-1973. We're also weaving in critical operational detail from Louis DeMarco on complex urban operations, and crucially, the political and media perspective from William M. Hammond's analysis of the Tet Offensive and the news media.
Right. And to really get the sheer magnitude of the shock that hit in 1968, we have to rewind just for a moment to the end of 1967. The environment in Washington and Saigon was characterized by what the historian Cosmos rightly calls enforced optimism.
Enforced optimism. That's a perfect way to capture the atmosphere. General William C. Westmoreland, the commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam at the time, was really the chief proponent of this upbeat view. You'll recall his famous address to the National Press Club on November 21st, 1967. He was painting a picture of progress, of impending relief.
Absolutely. He suggested that the military situation was improving so dramatically that, and I'm quoting him here, "It is conceivable to me that within 2 years or less, it will be possible for us to phase down our level of commitment."
And turn the war over to the Vietnamese.
Exactly, to the Vietnamese armed forces. He wasn't just planning for a phase reduction. He was actively promoting this narrative of success to the American public.
Yet behind that public optimism, the foundations were crumbling. Key figures like Secretary of Defense McNamara had become profoundly skeptical that escalation, just continuously sending more troops and heavier bombing would ever achieve American goals.
McNamara's change of heart was pivotal. By November 1967, he was urging President Johnson to cap American troop strength in South Vietnam at its current maximum of 525,000.
And not just that.
No. More importantly, he advocated for a complete cessation of the bombing campaign, Operation Rolling Thunder. His argument was clear. The current path was just unsustainable. It was increasing American costs, American casualties, without forcing North Vietnam to the negotiating table. He saw de-escalation as necessary to signal American good faith and hopefully encourage peace talks.
So on one hand, you have the commanding general insisting victory is close enough to start planning troop reductions. But on the other, the Secretary of Defense is arguing the whole military effort needs to be capped and maybe even paused because it's economically and politically bankrupting the United States.
Right.
And this internal dissonance was built entirely on a faulty assumption about what the enemy wanted to do.
Precisely. The bedrock of American strategic planning was the prevailing intelligence view, summarized in a special national intelligence estimate. It concluded that the communists recognized they could no longer achieve a complete military victory.
So the thinking was?
So the assumption was that Hanoi was settling into a protracted war of attrition. They would combine small unit guerrilla campaigns with some large unit fighting to exhaust American domestic patience and South Vietnamese resources, and ultimately force a favorable negotiated settlement. They were expecting a long grind, not a decisive, immediate knockout blow.
And that deeply held belief that the enemy had been relegated to a long, slow war is what makes the actual events that unfolded during the Lunar New Year, the Tet Offensive, such a profound and absolute strategic shock.
It wasn't just a shock. It was the refutation of the core strategic assessment that had guided the American effort for the previous 3 years.
Okay, so let's unpack this strategic shock. If American intelligence was so convinced the enemy was playing the long game, what was the actual thinking inside Hanoi?
Well, by mid-1967, the North Vietnamese leadership had reached a consensus that went directly against American assumptions. They coalesced around the general offensive general uprising strategy. This wasn't just a tactical shift. It was an attempt to blend these conflicting strategic factions within Hanoi.
So you had those who favored the protracted guerrilla war versus those who wanted big conventional military attacks.
Exactly. The plan was an unprecedented, massive military assault targeting the cities, combined with a synchronized mass popular revolt aimed at immediately overthrowing the South Vietnamese government.
So the enemy was planning for immediate, decisive victory, not a 5-year grind. That explains the scale, but it seems impossible that the United States intelligence community missed the preparation for such an immense operation.
They didn't entirely miss it, and this is where the story gets really critical. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong took enormous steps to conceal their preparations. Orders were disseminated late, units moved secretly, but American and South Vietnamese intelligence organizations accumulated a mountain of evidence throughout the fall and winter of 1967.
And this came from where?
It came from captured documents and intensive prisoner interrogations.
So who was seeing the writing on the wall then? Who was connecting the dots?
Several groups. Analysts at the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam J2 Current Intelligence Branch, the Combined Intelligence Center of Vietnam, and especially the Central Intelligence Agency station in Saigon. The Central Intelligence Agency station, according to the sources, was incredibly accurate. They predicted a nationwide offensive specifically targeting cities. They even accurately forecast the phases of the campaign, suggesting the city attacks might begin in January.
That sounds like actionable, detailed intelligence. So why the institutional resistance? Why did the system fail to act on it?
I think it was a failure of imagination, perhaps, rooted in these deeply held doctrinal beliefs. I mean, the sheer volume of captured documents pointing towards simultaneous nationwide city attacks was hard to dismiss. And the fact that the enemy was standing and fighting conventionally at places like Dak To in the Highlands was a clear tactical break.
But the senior command just couldn't see it.
Many senior commanders, steeped in conventional attrition warfare, simply could not accept that the Viet Cong would abandon their effective, low-risk guerrilla approach for a high-risk conventional assault on urban centers where United States firepower could be concentrated. They discounted the possibility that the enemy would court a catastrophic military failure by playing the Americans' game.
And Westmoreland's reaction is the perfect illustration of that strategic blindness. We know he directed the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Psychological Warfare Office in mid-December to plan a post-Tet program.
Yes, to capitalize on enemy pre-Tet promises that peace would come immediately after the holiday.
So he was planning for a PR victory.
He was planning for a public relations victory after a quiet holiday lull, not preparing for an existential defense of South Vietnam cities. That anecdote, it just captures the fundamental disconnect between the commander's public narrative and the looming reality.
And while this deep dive into the cities was being planned, the Americans were distracted by the so-called border battles.
Right.
These began in late 1967 and were orchestrated specifically to draw United States forces toward the frontiers. The simultaneous nature of these attacks in several core areas should have signaled a new level of strategic coordination.
And the most consuming distraction, of course, was the focus on the Marine base at Khe Sanh. General Westmoreland insisted on holding Khe Sanh, viewing it as the ideal opportunity to fight the enemy in a remote area, away from population centers, and destroy them using overwhelming air power and artillery.
But the anxiety surrounding Khe Sanh was almost entirely political, wasn't it? Washington saw this ghostly parallel to the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu.
Absolutely. The political anxiety was intense. Westmoreland emphatically rejected that parallel. He told his staff, "We are not, repeat not, going to be defeated at Khe Sanh."
He was determined.
He was determined to prove American will and capability. However, this intense preoccupation with the frontiers diverted critical strategic attention and resources right as the North Vietnamese launched their main effort elsewhere.
The main event, of course, launched around 3 in the morning on January 31st, 1968, striking cities all across South Vietnam. The immediate targets included the United States Embassy in Saigon, which provided that just devastating imagery for the world media. But the fighting in Hue, the old imperial capital, became the subject of an even more desperate contest, as our sources describe it.
Hue is a textbook case of complex urban operations, and Louis DeMarco's work really underscores just how ill-prepared the Allies were. Hue was divided, with the modern southern sector and the massive northern citadel, an ancient fortification with these 20-foot thick walls, The North Vietnamese occupied the entire citadel and much of the southern city.
But a crucial detail for operational analysis, the North Vietnamese failed to take the highest priority military and command centers in both sectors. They failed to overrun the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Compound in the south, and critically, the South Vietnamese Army 1st Division headquarters inside the citadel.
And the leadership shown by General Truong, the commander of the South Vietnamese Army 1st Division, was instrumental in this failure. He was a shrewd, competent leader who'd earned his rank through combat. Unlike some other commanders, he didn't freeze. He immediately ordered counterattacks by his reconnaissance and armored cavalry units to reinforce the headquarters position. He knew that if the headquarters fell, the city was lost.
And he quickly secured reinforcements, ordering the South Vietnamese Army 1st Airborne Task Force, 3 paratroop battalions, into the fight to counterattack inside the citadel. But the fighting was just characterized by brutal close quarters.
The ferocity of the urban combat cannot be overstated. Consider the United States Marine 1st Battalion of the 5th Marine Regiment. They were tasked with reinforcing the counterattack inside the citadel, and they were immediately engaged by enemy fire raining down from those ancient fortification walls. These walls, 20 feet thick, provided almost impervious cover.
So the United States Marines were facing a prepared, elevated enemy position. The fighting became this slow, agonizing grind. The 1st Battalion of the 5th Marine Regiment took tremendous casualties, often advancing just 1 block per day between February 14th and the 17th. I mean, that is the definition of close quarters, desperate fighting.
And the challenges for the South Vietnamese Marine units fighting alongside them were even more acute. Many were rushed directly from 2 weeks of continuous hard fighting in Saigon, hastily refitted with conscripts fresh from basic training. They lacked the heavy support weapons necessary for breaching fortified urban structures.
And their armor support.
Their armor support consisted largely of these M41 light tanks, which were utterly ineffective against the prepared concrete defenses of Hue. Their tank guns couldn't penetrate the fortified bunkers, and worse, the tanks themselves were highly vulnerable.
Easily destroyed by the standard North Vietnamese B-40 rockets.
Exactly. The North Vietnamese seemed to have an endless supply of these weapons, according to the sources.
And despite the overwhelming United States air power that was eventually brought to bear, the nature of urban combat really neutralized that Allied firepower advantage.
It did. It allowed the North Vietnamese to hold the city until it was finally liberated on February 25th. But the cost was staggering for both sides. The 1st Battalion of the 5th Marine Regiment, for instance, concluded its fighting on February 23rd, having sustained horrific losses just to secure the southern wall.
Now, let's pivot to the immediate aftermath and the psychological damage. Militarily, Westmoreland stressed that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had paid a high price in casualties. He was quick to insist they fail to hold any towns or trigger the promised general uprising. He viewed it as a tactical military victory for the Allies.
And on the ground in Saigon, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam headquarters, reflected the immediate danger. They adjusted to round-the-clock operations and organized a 530-man Military Assistance Command Vietnam Defense Force composed of officers and enlisted personnel.
It's amazing.
The fact that Westmoreland and senior officers felt compelled to bivouac at the headquarters for several weeks because it was, as General Davidson put it, just too goddamn dangerous to get out in the streets, well, that tells you everything about the immediate threat.
But as you pointed out, tactical victory did not equate to strategic success. As the military situation stabilized in Vietnam, the psychological and political war was being catastrophically lost in the United States.
This is where Hammond's analysis of the media is so crucial. The psychological damage wasn't caused just by the attacks themselves, but by the shattering of General Westmoreland's carefully constructed campaign of optimism. The American public had been told they were winning, that the end was in sight. Seeing the enemy strike everywhere simultaneously, including inside the supposedly secure United States Embassy compound, completely obliterated Westmoreland's credibility.
The famous quote summarizing this perception was that while Westmoreland might have won the tactical battle, he was losing or had already lost the psychological and political one.
And President Johnson's response sealed the new reality. He not only curtailed the Operation Rolling Thunder bombing, signaling a political shift, but he firmly refused Westmoreland's request for substantial reinforcements beyond an immediate 10,500 troops.
And that was it.
That marked the administration's definitive decision to level off the American effort. Escalation was off the table.
The lesson was brutal. You could win every single tactical battle, largely destroying the enemy's main force capability for a time, yet still lose the war because you lost the trust and political support of your own home front. That realization defined the next era.
The fallout from Tet and that reinforcement crisis directly led to the command change. In mid-1968, General Creighton W. Abrams replaced General Westmoreland, ushering in a fundamental strategic overhaul.
This new strategy was quickly dubbed the one war concept. So if Westmoreland was all about large unit attrition, what specifically did Abrams' one war entail, and how did it operationally differ?
Under Westmoreland, functions were rigidly divided. American units chased North Vietnamese Army main forces in the jungles and mountains, while the South Vietnamese Army was nominally responsible for territorial security and pacification.
Right.
Abrams abolished this division. The one war mandate required all Allied units, United States and South Vietnamese, to participate equally in 4 primary missions:
Which were?
attacking enemy main forces, guarding borders, defending cities, and supporting pacification.
So it sounds like a real shift toward true counterinsurgency, integrating political goals with military action.
It absolutely was.
Oh, wow.
The emphasis shifted dramatically, especially after the North Vietnamese August 1968 offensive also failed to achieve its objectives. Abrams directed his commanders to pivot toward an intensive drive against the Viet Cong infrastructure and political apparatus. This was the recognition that the political shadow government of the Viet Cong had to be dismantled if stability were ever to be achieved, regardless of how many enemy battalions were defeated in the field.
And this commitment to the people on the ground was formalized.
Yes. Protecting the populace was explicitly designated as the primary role. This meant shifting resources, changing rules of engagement, and integrating military operations with civil operations and revolutionary development support. The massive pacification effort, in a way that Westmoreland's attrition strategy never truly prioritized.
And this strategic framework was essential because it laid the groundwork for the eventual American exit.
That exit, of course, became the next major political priority with the arrival of the Nixon administration: Vietnamization.
Vietnamization, so that was 2 distinct things, right?
Right. First, the comprehensive withdrawal of United States combat troops, and second, the rapid and thorough improvement of the South Vietnamese armed forces.
The Nixon administration formalized this goal in April 1969 with National Security Study Memorandum 36. This memo was highly political. It directed the Department of Defense to prepare hard timetables for transferring all combat responsibility to the South Vietnamese armed forces, ranging from 18 to 42 months.
And here we hit the first major tension point. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, while accepting the need for withdrawal, reacted with deep caution to these fixed deadlines. They warned Washington that the 18 and 24-month options posed severe dangers to both the pacification gains and overall military security.
So they were essentially advocating for flexibility over political expediency.
Exactly. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, urged a cut-and-try approach, meaning withdrawals should be based on thorough, empirical evaluation of the effects of preceding withdrawals and the achieved capability of the South Vietnamese armed forces.
Not based on a calendar.
Not on an arbitrary deadline set in Washington. But Washington, driven by domestic politics and budgetary constraints, increasingly favored the fixed deadline.
Okay, let's delve into the complexity of modernizing the South Vietnamese armed forces. President Nguyen Van Thieu had these ambitious, almost maximalist goals.
He did. Thieu proposed an enormous enlargement of the South Vietnamese armed forces to over 1 million men, coupled with the introduction of heavy, sophisticated equipment armor, artillery, and air defense. He wanted a conventional force capable of meeting the North Vietnamese army head-on.
But General Abrams was more cautious about the feasibility of this massive transformation.
Abrams recommended a smaller increase, just under 992,000 men, and crucially, he favored keeping the force essentially light.
And why was that?
Because he intended for the South Vietnamese armed forces to remain dependent on a United States residual support force for key sophisticated capabilities like air support, heavy artillery, and complex logistics. He simply didn't believe the South Vietnamese system had the logistical, maintenance, or educational capacity to fully operate and sustain heavy, high-tech forces on their own in the long run.
But this changes completely in November 1969 when Secretary of Defense Melvin R. Laird enters the picture with a new, much more aggressive plan.
Laird dramatically raised the stakes. He instructed planners to develop a Phase 3 improvement and modernization plan, a plan designed to make the South Vietnamese armed forces capable of coping with the combined Viet Cong North Vietnamese Army threat entirely on their own by July 1973.
The removal of that assumption of a long-term United States residual support force is massive. It implies that every piece of equipment, every maintenance schedule, and every training objective had to suddenly shift from supporting a temporary United States presence to ensuring permanent self-sufficiency.
It was a substantial political and military departure. Lair's reasoning was rooted in necessity. Politically, the massive expense of modernization couldn't be justified merely to permit the South Vietnamese to manage a local insurgency. They had to be ready to stand alone against a conventional North Vietnamese invasion. As General Wheeler noted, this instruction represented a substantial departure from the Vietnamization concept as we have known it up to now. The July 1973 deadline was about getting the United States out of the check writing and air support business, regardless of military readiness.
It's just an enormous historical irony that Vietnamization, this policy of withdrawal, coincided with the physical expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos.
This was President Nixon's core strategy. Disengage American ground troops to satisfy the domestic political demand while simultaneously maximizing military pressure on enemy sanctuaries outside South Vietnam.
The goal was twofold.
Exactly. Disrupt their supply lines and gain maximum leverage for the negotiators in Paris.
And the primary target for this new external pressure was the Central Office for South Vietnam Headquarters, the alleged nerve center of the enemy's operations, which was pinpointed just across the border in the Fishhook area of Cambodia.
In February 1969, Nixon ordered covert B-52 strikes Operation Breakfast as part of the wider Operation Menu series. The political sensitivity was extreme. Nixon was so fearful of political leakage while he was in Europe that he actually canceled the initial execution of Operation Breakfast before it launched, only reauthorizing it later. The aim was the destruction of the Central Office for South Vietnam headquarters, but the covert nature really demonstrated how domestic politics were now guiding operational execution.
Meanwhile, General Abrams was making these subtle internal shifts to manage the perception of the war inside South Vietnam.
He was attempting to reduce the public visibility of continuing American offensives. He famously instructed commanders to stop using the politically charged term search and destroy.
So what did they use instead?
Instead, they were to substitute terms like spoiling attack or reconnaissance in force. It was a linguistic effort to signal a lower tempo and reduce the appearance of aggressive American initiative, even as fighting continued.
But the political visibility of American casualties was impossible to escape, especially following high-casualty battles like Hamburger Hill in May 1969.
The domestic fallout was severe. It prompted Secretary Laird to suggest easing offensive pressure to reduce American losses. Laird consistently questioned the core military thesis that constant offensive pressure minimize overall friendly casualties by preempting larger enemy attacks. He was focused on the body count at home.
But Abrams and Admiral McCain, the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, they consistently pushed back, right?
They did. They argued that reducing the offensive tempo was an invitation for the enemy to mass for larger attacks, which would ultimately raise casualties in the long run. The debate was essentially political optics versus operational necessity.
This period also saw the continuation of deep doctrinal disputes over air power, a conflict that had plagued the Military Assistance Command Vietnam since its inception. Abrams was a fierce proponent of unified command and fought hard for control of air assets.
This goes back to General Westmoreland's contentious imposition of single management in I Corps, which placed Marine fixed-wing aircraft under 7th Air Force control.
And the Marines hated this.
The Marine Corps objected violently to this single management structure. Their argument was that the Marine Corps system was consumer-oriented, meaning the ground forces commander could quickly and directly request and receive close air support that matched their specific needs. The Air Force's producer-oriented system, the Marines argued, slowed support and complicated the chain of command, particularly in rapid response situations. This was not a minor bureaucratic spat. This was about life and death responsiveness on the battlefield.
And Westmoreland and later Abrams defended single management as essential for unified control during a crisis. It was about ensuring that assets could be concentrated where needed, such as during the intense fighting at Khasan. The sources suggest Abrams considered resigning over this issue during his tenure, which underscores just how deeply felt and strategically important unified air control was to him.
And while all these external battles were being fought, the United States military itself was facing a profound internal crisis as withdrawal accelerated.
The withdrawal period saw a rapid and general deterioration of discipline, leadership, and morale within the American ranks. What were the root causes of this systemic decay?
There were several factors that combined. The political and social unrest back home, the sense that the war was being lost or was pointless, and crucially, military policies themselves. The one-year tour policy, which ensured constant unit turnover, prevented the formation of cohesive, experienced leadership teams. The decision not to call up the reserves led to an all-volunteer, Vietnam-only force facing immense pressure.
And the result was?
The result was a dramatic rise in drug use, severe racial violence, and internal dissent, culminating in fragging attacks by enlisted men on their own officers and non-commissioned officers.
So General Abrams tried to manage the information environment. He adopted a new policy in June 1968 to let results speak for themselves, avoiding propaganda and reporting the bad news alongside the good.
But despite this attempt at transparency, relations with the media spiraled downward into mutual hostility, fueled partly by the administration's own adversarial posture toward the press. Then came the devastating revelations of the My Lai massacre, which forced immediate and decisive action from Abrams.
He had to enforce the rules of engagement with renewed vigor, emphasizing the absolute requirement for real sensitivity toward the Vietnamese people.
And this scrutiny had immediate, chilling consequences on the ground. Junior officers became extremely concerned about facing legal action and a lack of institutional support for battlefield mistakes. The result, critically, was that commanders increasingly avoided maneuver and engagement in populated areas. They began making decisions based on avoiding adverse publicity and legal risk, rather than military necessity.
This leads us to the penultimate test of Vietnamization during this phase, the Laos incursion, Operation Lam Son 719, in early 1971.
This is authorized by Nixon in late 1970, again with dual goals: preempting enemy attacks and, critically, testing the South Vietnamese Armed Forces' ability to conduct major offensive operations. The aim was to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail near the logistics hub of Chaponi. It was a South Vietnamese army attack, fully supported by massive United States air power, but crucially, without United States ground advisors accompanying the South Vietnamese units.
And the intelligence differences leading up to Lam Son 719 were stark, suggesting a major disconnect within the Allied command structure.
Indeed. Abrams' staff, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, anticipated light opposition. They estimated the North Vietnamese would not be able to contest the area for 3 weeks, allowing the South Vietnamese army to dash to the 30-odd miles to Chaponi quickly.
They were dangerously optimistic.
Dangerously optimistic. The Central Intelligence Agency, however, concluded correctly that the North Vietnamese strongly anticipated the offensive, were reinforcing the area with heavy troop concentrations around Chaponi, and were prepared to resist vigorously and promptly.
And the Central Intelligence Agency's analysis proved accurate. The South Vietnamese army immediately ran into severe, unexpected resistance.
They encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire, which caused rapid United States helicopter losses and armored counterattacks. This overwhelming resistance quickly exposed weaknesses in senior South Vietnamese military leadership. General Lam, the commander of Military Region 1, was simply beyond his depth, commanding a corps-sized, pitched battle.
And compounding the leadership weaknesses was the intervention of President Thieu himself.
Thieu visited Lam's headquarters and personally intervened in tactical decisions, directing the operational commander to halt the westward advance toward Chaponi and instead shift forces to securing the flanks and Highway 9.
So this presidential micromanagement led to a tactical halt halfway to the objective.
Yes, and that allowed the North Vietnamese to bring even more forces to bear.
Ultimately, the South Vietnamese forces retreated with heavy losses, especially American helicopters, though many South Vietnamese soldiers fought bravely. Yet, Abrams chose to claim overall success.
He did. He argued that despite the tactical setbacks, the operations had successfully forestalled major enemy offensives in South Vietnam during 1971. And by doing that, he validated the Vietnamization timeline and pacification progress. The measurable low level of combat activity within South Vietnam during the rest of 1971 gave his claim political weight, regardless of the heavy operational losses suffered in Laos.
So by early 1972, the American presence was severely reduced. We were down to only 139,000 men, and United States ground combat operations had largely ceased. This made the advisory and air support roles paramount.
And this was the window of vulnerability that Hanoi chose for its massive 1972 Easter offensive. This was not a guerrilla action. This was a heavy conventional push utilizing armor and large-scale artillery. The scale of firepower came as a distinct shock to many South Vietnamese Army units outside Military Region 1 who had not previously faced such a sophisticated mechanized attack.
And General Abrams' response was immediate and tactical, leveraging the remaining United States assets.
He quickly rearranged withdrawal schedules to retain critical United States combat support units, things like helicopter companies, and a 175-millimeter gun battalion to plug gaps in the South Vietnamese Armed Forces' heavy fire support capability. He also rapidly introduced sophisticated weaponry, most notably the tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided anti-tank missile, which was critical for giving the South Vietnamese Army a fighting chance against the heavy North Vietnamese armor.
However, the early defeats were less about equipment and more about poor leadership, weren't they?
Absolutely. The South Vietnamese Armed Forces' initial failures were largely rooted in inadequate senior military leadership, particularly in military regions 1, 2, and 3. Some commanders just folded under the conventional pressure.
This prompted decisive intervention from the American leadership.
It did. General Abrams and Ambassador Bunker met with President Thieu in early May 1972, delivering an unvarnished assessment of the general's inadequacies and warning that the results of the entire Vietnamization effort were now at stake.
And Thieu acted.
Thieu acted quickly, making crucial command changes. He replaced General Lam in Military Region 1 with Lieutenant General Ngo Quang Trong. Trong was widely considered by the Americans to be South Vietnam's most competent field general, and his appointment was a massive morale and operational boost. His leadership proved instrumental in stabilizing the Northern Front.
And while the South Vietnamese army was fighting on the ground, President Nixon unleashed the full fury of American air and naval power in Operation Linebacker, including the renewed bombing of North Vietnam and the mining of harbors. This massive application of force was meant to stem the tide and send a message.
And here, the old command control issues resurfaced, but with global stakes. Nixon, concerned that Abrams was sluggish in utilizing air power, directed that the entire B-52 strength be committed to the northern region. General Abrams, enraged by this political intervention in his tactical domain, reportedly threatened to resign if Washington dictated his air allocations.
Because Abrams was focused on the tactical battlefield. He was arguing that diverting critical air assets from the fighting in the South would lead to a rapid collapse, especially in Military Region 1, where General Truong was newly taking command.
Meanwhile, this tension revealed Nixon's deep distrust of the regular bureaucracy. We see the White House increasingly bypassing Secretary Laird and the regular state and defense channels. They utilized the direct bunker channel, these covert Central Intelligence Agency message channels, to transmit instructions and requests directly to Abrams.
So the White House saw the bombing of the North through a geopolitical lens. They were using air power as leverage against the Soviet Union and China to force diplomatic concessions.
All right. And Abrams, conversely, saw air power as the non-negotiable tactical lifeline for his ally in the South. The bunker channel was the symptom of this high-level disconnect between tactical reality and strategic geopolitics.
And despite the intense fighting of the Eastern Offensive, the American disengagement process continued. General Abrams planned the final reorganization of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam.
He did. He decided to abandon the Interim Vietnam Assistance Command designation, opting instead to revert directly to a smaller Military Assistance Advisory Group status upon the termination of the combat role.
General Frederick C. Widen succeeded Abrams as the commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam in June 1972, just as the peace negotiations in Paris were accelerating dramatically.
The diplomatic breakthrough arrived in October 1972, when the North Vietnamese dropped their long-standing political demand for President Thieu's removal. This opened the final pathway to the signing of the peace agreement in January 1973.
Following the agreement, the final drawdown, codenamed Operation Countdown, began. The remaining 23,335 American personnel, mostly logistics and air support, left within the mandated 60 days.
And the immense structure of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam stood down, and its functions were rapidly transferred. Advisory and support roles went to the U.S. Support Activities Group 7th Air Force and the Defense Attaché Office. Significantly, the massive civil operations and revolutionary development support structure, the core of the pacification effort, stood down in February 1973, transferring its responsibilities to the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. Agency for International Development.
The Military Assistance Command Vietnam staff then formed the core of the United States delegation to the four-party Joint Military Commission, which was responsible for implementing the ceasefire and dealing with immediate issues like prisoner exchanges.
But the sources make it clear that the commission immediately ran into the fundamental, unsolved political military problem that was avoided in Paris, defining each side's precise area of territorial control. This crucial mission immediately set the stage for future conflict, as both sides engaged in aggressive, last-minute land grabbing right up until the ceasefire took effect. It was an armed truce, not a peace.
So, as we synthesize this entire complex transition phase, the South Vietnamese armed forces in 1973 were objectively larger, better equipped, and certainly more capable than they were before the massive American intervention. I mean, the Eastern Offensive proved that with United States air support and advice, they could successfully repel a full-scale invasion by heavy North Vietnamese divisions.
That is the limited success of Vietnamization. But the paradox remains deep. Those forces were still fundamentally plagued by internal issues: uneven and corrupt leadership, high desertion rates, and severe issues with maintenance and logistics.
And most critically, the force structure created by the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, was inherently unsustainable. It was too heavy and conventional for effective counterinsurgency, yet simultaneously too dependent on lavish American subsidies and sophisticated weaponry to fight a mobile conventional war without massive United States air backup.
Cosmos's conclusion is stark. Vietnamization succeeded in providing what Nixon and Kissinger needed: a healthy interval for American disengagement and securing for South Vietnam a fighting chance to survive. But it failed in its primary military goal, creating a self-sufficient force. It allowed the United States to exit on its own terms, but it did not, in the end, secure the lasting survival of its ally without that continued immense aid. This entire story, from Westmoreland's push for escalation to Abrams' shift to disengagement, is threaded with a constant battle over command control of air power. Both commanders continually sought to gain direct, unified control of the air war over North Vietnam, and they were continually rebuffed by Pacific Command and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yet when the ultimate test came in 1972, it was the massive, unconstrained application of air power Operation Linebacker, dictated directly by the White House, that became the definitive factor in stalling the Eastern Offensive and forcing the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table.
Which raises this final provocative thought. When future conflicts demand rapid, decisive action or strategic disengagement, what does the legacy of these command struggles, the constant friction between the theater commander and the layers of bureaucracy over who controls the fighters and bombers, suggest? Does this history confirm that unified, theater-wide control over air assets is the ultimate non-negotiable requirement for successful strategic disengagement? Abrams and his predecessors consistently asked for it. Washington only provided it when failure was imminent.
It forces you to consider whether a different command structure, granting that authority earlier, could have fundamentally altered the course and credibility of the entire withdrawal strategy, perhaps even ensuring the long-term success of the South Vietnamese state. A truly profound point on the limits and leverage of military power.